You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday 30th of January 2015. T4TD, Russia, Islam, NHS and the real problem. By the way, T4TD stands for Thought for Today. Hundreds of UK child sex offenders spared jail, let off with cautions. House building hits 7-year high, more family homes on the market as detached new builds rise by a quarter. School isolates Somerset teenager over cancer charity haircut. Swedish soldier stirs row over help for ISIS fighters. Marine Le Pen leads French presidential poll with 30% of the vote. Woman who banned Muslims for her Arkansas gun range says business is booming since she banished them as a matter of public safety. And Egypt's El-Sisi cuts short Ethiopia visit after ISIS-affiliated terrorist group kills 26 in deadly Sinai attacks. And finally, 2 for 1 Day Friday. UK news. Hundreds of UK child sex offenders spared jail, let off with cautions. Hundreds of sex offenders are being given lenient punishments by British judges despite committing abhorrent crimes against children. According to official figures from the Ministry of Justice, hundreds of sex offenders have been let off with cautions despite the law saying they should face jail sentences of up to 14 years. According to the Ministry of Justice, there were 7,057 cautions handed to sex offenders in the UK since 2009. The figures come as authorities investigate allegations of historic child abuse during the 1970s and 1980s, including a suspected elite paedophile ring consisting of serving British politicians. Charities, including the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, NSPCC, have said the cautions may have been used if there was an issue regarding children having to give evidence in court, but warned that British courts needed to do more to protect victims of abuse. A custodial sentence for serious sexual offences sends a very clear message that society will not accept their behaviour in any way. It also reflects the lifelong damage that sexual abuse can have on children and young people, NSPCC spokesperson John Brown said. A prison sentence can also mean the offender is given therapy to ensure they understand the impact of their behaviour and to reduce their risk of re-offending. In response to the figures, ministers claim they're changing the law to stop the use of cautions on sex offenders. Earlier this month, Home Secretary Theresa May came under fire for failing to get the historic child abuse inquiry off the ground after 2 consecutive chairwomen left after conflicts of interest. World at 8. This is the dumb chasing the even dumber. Historic sexual abuse relies on hype and lies amidst a small parcel of truth. It is what the public want it to be. Awful though it is, most of these offenders are probably dead or in other countries. House building hits 7-year high. More family homes on the market as detached new builds rise by a quarter. New figures reveal a dramatic rise in the number of detached homes being built in the UK last year, up to 24% on 2013, with more of this type of property being built than any other time since 2004. Detached homes are making a comeback with 38,113 new build properties of this type registered last year with the National House Building Council, NHBC, which released the figures. Across all types of property, 145,174 new homes across the UK were registered with the NHBC in 2014, marking a 9% increase on 2013 and the highest annual total since 2007 as the economic recovery continues. Yorkshire and the Humber, Wales, Northern Ireland, the West Midlands and the South East are all now outpacing London in terms of the year-on-year percentage growth in the number of new builds being registered. Wales recorded the strongest percentage jump, with registrations up by 1/3, 33% on 2013. The NHBC said London saw an exceptional growth in the number of new builds being registered in 2013, and in 2014 growth in the capital was more in line with that seen in the UK generally as many other regions caught up. Despite the boost in new build numbers, the NHBC said that 2014's total remains below the average of 153,000 registrations seen per year over the last 4 decades. World at 8. Soon we will become a huge refugee camp for foreigners who do not integrate and do cost us and take our jobs despite publicity to the contrary. Not everyone needs an Asian takeaway or a Polish cleaner, do they? School isolates Somerset teenager over cancer charity haircut. A teenager who shaved his head to raise money for charity has been put into isolation for breaking school rules. Stan Locke, 14, a pupil at Churchill Academy, North Somerset, said he wanted to raise funds for the Macmillan because cancer affects so many people. He got the #1 haircut on Sunday after playing rugby for Winscombe RFC. Head teacher Dr Barry Ratton said Stan had been in isolation for 3 days, but this would now be reviewed. Stan said he'd been in isolation because his head teacher did not approve of the haircut. His mother, Melanie Rees, said she was incredibly proud of what her son had done. "I hope the school would have shown some element of judgment and would have made an exception," she said. Stan's been overwhelmed with messages of support from his friends. Stan's head shave had raised almost £200 on Friday morning, but that figure has now gone up to almost 500. Macmillan Cancer Research said it cannot comment on individual school policies, but was very grateful to Stan for his fundraising efforts, which will make a real difference to the lives of people affected by cancer. The Academy is now reviewing whether Stan should continue to be isolated. A petition to have him reinstated into class has attracted more than 600 signatures, and the Free Stan Locke Facebook page has been liked 529 times. World at 8. Good lad, a doer instead of a talker. This academy needs a good talking to say the least. Boycott it until it's seen the light. European news. A Swedish soldier stirs row over help for ISIS fighters. A Swedish soldier's Facebook post from Afghanistan is causing a stir after he suggested that he was likely to get less help when he came back to Sweden than returning ISIS fighters. Fredrik Brandberg's comments originally appeared on as his Facebook status on Sunday afternoon before spreading across Swedish media. Writing in both English and Swedish, he questioned his future situation upon returning to Sweden, including options for work. "In a few months I'm back in Sweden after being deployed in Afghanistan against Taliban and others who have really jeopardised development in this very sore country," he said. "There is no permanent job waiting for me when I come home." The officer, who is currently headquartered in Kabul on his third mission to Afghanistan, then compares his situation to that of returning ISIS fighters from Syria, noting recent calls from several Swedish government representatives who have argued that extremists should be given more help to reintegrate upon returning to Sweden. The Swedish soldier addresses Mona Sahlin, in particular, a former leader of the Social Democrat Party, who is now Sweden's official coordinator against violent extremism. "I read that Mona Sahlin, together with other Swedish political leaders, are anxious to take care of Swedish IS warriors coming home from being involved in Syria, with especially designed programmes for work and other issues that would make them function well in our society." Brandberg refers to his post as Utmaningen, or the challenge. "It would be wonderful if I was met with a comparable programme after my homecoming, after which I could feel safe in having a regular job with monthly income and a social stable situation in the society where I wouldn't need to wonder whether I'm wanted or not," he argued. A spokesperson for the Swedish Armed Forces told the Local on Monday that what happens to soldiers upon their return from war was not an issue that fell under its mandate. Lovely. On Wednesday, Swedish Armed Forces head of press Philip Simon clarified that the Swedish Armed Forces does take care of their soldiers upon their return to Sweden. He added that while finding them work does not fall under its jurisdiction and is the responsibility of the wider Swedish society, the Armed Forces does have several organisations in place to assist returning veterans. Simon reiterated helping ISIS fighters is not an issue for the Swedish military. The Swedish Defence and Foreign Ministries remained unavailable for comment on Wednesday. World at 8. Makes you want to join the Swedish Army, doesn't it, lads? It's worse in the UK. Here, returning soldiers can sleep on the pavements and no one in government gives a toss. Marine Le Pen leads French presidential poll with 30% of vote. The leader of France's controversial anti-immigration party, Front National, Marine Le Pen, has emerged as the frontrunner ahead of the country's 2017 presidential election, according to a poll conducted by French polling agency IFOP and published today in this week's issue of Marianne magazine. According to the poll conducted last weekend, if the first round of the election were held now, the Front National leader would win around 30% of the public vote, beating hypothetical centre-right challengers Nicolas Sarkozy and Alain Juppé, as well as socialist Manuel Valls, all of whom polled at 23%, should they choose to run. Current President François Hollande, whose approval ratings doubled following his handling of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which killed 17 people in Paris, received only 21%. Independent or smaller party candidates would take approximately 20% of the vote in the first round. According to the poll, as no candidate would ever win over 50% of the vote in the first round, the election will be decided by a second round between the Marine Le Pen and whichever other candidate has the second largest share of the votes. World at 8. At least the Front National is a true anti-immigration party. What's wrong with that? World news. Woman who banned Muslims from her Arkansas gun range says business is booming since she banished them as a matter of public safety. A gun range owner who banned Muslims from her business as a matter of public safety claims trade has quadrupled since the controversial move. Jan Morgan decided to bar all followers of Islam from her gun cave indoor firing range in Hot Springs, Arkansas last September, while claiming the religion commands them to kill her. 5 months on, she says business is booming and that threats of a lawsuit by federal civil rights enforcers have failed to materialise. The American Islamic Relations had written to the Attorney General Eric Holder to investigate the gun range on the grounds of racial and religious discrimination. The group's attorney, Jennifer Wicks, said at the time the move could inevitably result in a hostile environment for ordinary Muslims in Arkansas. But Morgan has no plans to back down, despite receiving threats from the contentious decision, and even claims business has quadrupled, with people coming from out of state and some offering donations for what they predict will be a legal battle. Morgan said she excludes those she believes to be Muslim based on their names. "We are dealing in lethal firearms," Morgan told FoxNews.com. "I'm not going to let a Nazi shoot in here or a Ku Klux Klan member in here either." She added in her blog that she believed the Quran contains 109 verses commanding hate, murder and terror, and claims threats on her life have been made by Muslims. World at 8. One brave woman amongst a band of running scared and liberal Yanks. There is no such thing as an ordinary Muslim by virtue of their belief. Taliban not a terrorist group, White House Deputy Press Secretary says. White House Deputy Press Secretary Eric Schultz argued during Wednesday's briefing that the United States can negotiate prisoner swaps with Taliban members because the Taliban is not considered a terrorist group. ABC News reporter John Carl asked the press briefing Ruci whether the Jordanian government's trade with the Islamic State was similar to the United States trading 5 Taliban members for Army Sergeant Bowie Bergdahl, the Washington Free Beacon reported. "As you know, this was highly discussed at the time and prisoner swaps are a traditional end of conflict interaction that happens," Mr Schultz said. "As the war in Afghanistan wound down, we felt like it was the appropriate thing to do. The President's bedrock commitment as Commander-in-Chief is to leave no man or woman behind. That's the principle he was operating under." "Isn't that what the Jordanians are operating under?" the ABC reporter argued. "The Taliban are still conducting terror attacks, so you can't really say the war has ended as far as they're concerned." Mr Schultz explained, "I would also point out the Taliban is an armed insurgency. Islamic State is a terrorist group, so we don't make concessions to terrorist groups." "You don't think the Taliban's a terrorist group?" Mr Carl interjected. "I don't think that the Taliban is an armed insurgency," Mr Schultz corrected. "This was the winding down of the war in Afghanistan and that's why this arrangement was dealt." World at 8. Difficult point here. In truth, the Taliban are a resistance movement more than terrorists. They started out resisting the Russians and now resist everything. But you can't class them in the same mould as ISIS. Egypt's El-Sisi cuts short Ethiopia visit after ISIS-affiliated terrorist group kills 26 in deadly Sinai attacks. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi cut short a visit to Ethiopia for an African Union summit on Friday following a wave of deadly attacks in the Sinai Peninsula claimed by Islamic State's Egyptian wing. Sisi's office said in a statement that el-Sisi, who was scheduled to address the summit, would head back to Cairo after the opening session on Friday morning. At least 26 security personnel were killed late on Thursday in 4 separate attacks in North Sinai in some of the worst anti-government violence in months. Egypt is fighting an Islamist insurgency based in the Sinai. Hundreds of members of the security forces have been killed since the army ousted President Mohammed Mursi of the Muslim Brotherhood in July 2013 after mass protests against his rule. The Brotherhood denies any links to the insurgents, but the government makes no distinction between them. The most active militant group, Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, changed its name to Sinai Province last year when it swore allegiance to Islamic State, the hardline Sunni militant group that has seized swathes of Iraq and Syria, drawing US-led airstrikes. The attacks on the peninsula, which borders Israel and the Gaza Strip, were the deadliest since 33 security personnel were killed in 2 attacks in October. The week had already been a bloody one for the Arab world's most populous nation. More than 25 people were killed at the weekend when security forces fired at protesters, angered by what many perceive as a police state. World at 8. Sisi is a strong man for a strong problem. Thought for the day: Russia, Islam, the NHS and the real problem. So we in this country now have a problem with Putin. Strange that. I always thought we had a problem with the Russians only when their oligarchs descended with their terrible taste and habitual premise of buying into our wonderful and traditional real estate in London and the home counties. After all, there should be no problem with Putin, bless him, as we've taken in all the gangsters who made their money out of Mother Russia and would only have ruined their economy quicker than the UN and the EU are now trying to do. Ukraine notwithstanding, it's well known that President Putin is a patriot. But he is a patriot of Russia, not other splinter countries within or without. This is the nature of patriotism. It excludes the countries the said patriot is patriotic about, usually his or her own country. This is why people who are accused of being neo-Nazis usually have a bit of a giggle. How can you be paying homage to an ideology that is essentially Germanic and was brought to the boil as an Aryan and Germanic pot? Does this mean that all neo-Nazis or black shirts or whatever would profess their patriotism to Germany? Of course not. So patriotism is in itself a pure thought and entirely endemic to the person and their country. Something the UN and other diversity and Marxist machines would never acknowledge. Patriotism is the bad boy of the bundle, the enemy of democracy and the enemy of multiculturalism. Putin is getting bad press because he is a patriot, not a universal politician. Simple as that. And as we know, the world does not like patriots. Our NHS is in the bad press corner as well, and for the life of me I can't understand why. Waiting times have always been bad in emergency departments, even before the inrush of foreigners onto this soil. Cartoons of skeletons sitting and waiting their turn were de facto even in the 1980s. But of course common sense ruled then that you only went to A&E if you had had an accident or an emergency, not because your local GP was too busy to see you or you needed an ambulance to repair a broken false nail, one of the calls received by the much maligned 111 service. Now, looking at the film of 111, for once on the TV they had not monitored the footage, so we saw that the vast majority of that call centre were ethnics, and judging by the voiceover of an actress who was blowing the whistle in a big way, she was either black or her Cockney accent was genuine. Either one doesn't make one feel confident, but I speak as I find, and when using that service almost 2 years ago for my husband, I found them marvellous and quick. But cannot comment in areas heavily enriched, of course, where the sheer numbers of people have quadrupled in the last couple of decades. More people in this country means more public services under pressure. You don't need a heavily biased news team to know that. I will stand by what I think, and that is the NHS was the only good thing to come out of any Labour government, and they are hell-bent on destroying it by encouraging immigration and training foreign nurses when they can't be bothered to train or pay our own would-be nurses. It is a well-known fact that the Filipino nurses use this country to retrain, earn money and get experience, and then hightail it off to the States for even more cash. I'm of the opinion that nowadays people who leave their countries are gutless traitors. For the most part, many of these people have contributed to the low standard of living and avoided mending their countries or giving back, and are in fact parasites looking for the nearest large host to live off, and the UK and Europe qualify. And our NHS has never been so under attack because we are the only country in the world to have an NHS, and like most Brits, we don't look after or protect what we have. Labour is using their weapon against their own innovation. Immigration versus the National Health Service, and this sort of negative hype should be ignored when there are not the means or the people to see any changes through in a proper fashion. Now Islam, and frankly by the time I saw Keith Vaz pontificating on the fact his department had let various details of the historic abuse cases onto the web, and the fact that it was seen that on every film, play or series, both from the US and the UK, that there is a warning out that no white person should partner up with anything that isn't black or coloured. Couples who stick to their own kind are also up there with the Putin and NHS hate mail. But to diversify just a tad, coloured is an acceptable description. I say this because poor Benedict Cumberbatch is walking the walk of shame and going through the racist hoops for calling a black person coloured. And he's quite right. Black people are coloured. Brown, yellow, bronze, dark cream or coffee coloured, they are coloured people as opposed to white people. No better, but different. And how would you describe a coffee coloured person who was not a black African or West Indian? You would insult him by calling him black, 'cause he ain't. But he is coloured, as Obama is coloured, not black. He's half white, so why he keeps going to the dark side I will never know. Coloured is okay, white is okay, and black is okay if you're as black as the ace of spades. I'm an artist and colours matter. Get over it. Now back to Islam and fuss over the Jordanian pilot and ISIS. ISIS is doing what it does well. It gets publicity. For various governments to say they don't negotiate with terrorists is all well and good, but of course they do. I would return the female failed suicide bomber with her vest and make sure it explodes when she starts the return journey to ISIS and hope that she takes a few of them with her. They never state what condition they want their people back, do they? The news that the states are giving the military guys to train what they call medium-risk terrorists to fight ISIS is simply ridiculous. How the hell can a non-Muslim and non-terrorist spot a medium-risk outfit over in the hell that has become Iraq or Syria? Why on earth doesn't the states guard its own borders or make war on the drug lords of Mexico? There's more than enough training to do in their own country, and the same applies to us. But amidst all this fluff and bother is a worrying factor, and that is not the outcome of the next election. It is a simple and small paragraph in a daily paper that reads: "The Bank of England will keep interest rates at an all-time low for the next 5 years or till 2020. Oh whoopee, I bet the people with jobs will say, oh likewise the young migrants and the non-savers. Well, you need to be afraid, be very afraid. This is yet another ploy by the banks to raise the price of property and to encourage the help to buy market and the so-called first-timers, which usually are unfortunately our own, to buy, and the richer to buy to lets will have a field day. But in 2020, if not before, if they're pressed, once interest rates start to rise, they will soar up, and I would bet that the vast majority of people who have bought when interest rates are ridiculous will not be able to afford a more normal rate. Thus the properties will fall into negative equity, the bailiffs and the banks will move in, and voila, there will be a huge amount of young homeless people and an equally huge amount of Asians or foreign buyers who will be able to buy cheaply off the banks or the estate agents, and again a gigantic move has been made on the social engineering scale against the indigenous young of this country. It is a win-win situation. The banks win, big business wins, any government wins, non-Brits win big time as usual, and foreign investors win. The fact that this is all in the making now will escape all the news headlines until, as usual, it is too late, and then of course the usual inquiry and investigation will fall flat if ever undertaken. Any government has to find the money to fund the EU, foreign aid, a self-made wobbly NHS and a crumbling education service, as well as paying out benefits for millions of foreigners who are or are not living in this country. Nothing comes free, and the diversity project is the most expensive of all. It was undertaken in this country because the Brits are not patriots as a rule, they cannot wait to leave this place for other climes, and because of the multicultural ethos which abounds now in England and the virtual Marxist ethics regarding family and religion. Any other culture can and has taken hold, and not only with our blessing and the blessing of our governments, but with our money. It costs to put Brits out of work. It costs to shut down factories and replace them with supermarkets. It costs to send virtually everything we use to make to be made in a foreign country. It costs to make the average family man redundant in his short working career. It costs to send mothers to work instead of fathers. It costs too much to even think about to allow foreigners to build and to buy to let to our own poor. It costs to allow England to become the hate child of the EU and the rest of the world, and that cost is not only money, it is respect, tradition and patriotism. And once those go, we will not be far behind. Our birth rates are low because we've become greedy and selfish, and that is just what Marxism is, greedy and selfish. No one does anything for their country anymore, just themselves, and although terrible, even more terrible is the fact that we are importing various foreigners to do just the same. Talk about a snake in the grass, and I like snakes, but not those varieties. So when listening to the BBC or ITV News, think about what they want you to listen to and believe, and then turn it off. You must admit, however liberal you might be, we have sold out big time. Our media is no longer English, our papers are no longer English, our streets are no longer English, our industries are no longer English, and even our food is no longer English. And most of all, our standards are no longer English. Soon, but how soon, will we be English? And finally, unseasonal but true. This isn't funny, but when you think just how much money our governments go through to keep foreign investors sweet. The 12 tax dodgers of Christmas. 12 CDs playing. Amazon got UK. Paid just 3 million tax on sales of 4 billion. 11 muffin baking. Cafe Nero. Paid no tax on 40 million profits last year. 10 whiskies blending. Johnny Walker, parent company pays just over 2% tax. 9 Blu-rays skipping. Savvy, parent ships products from UK via the USA to avoid paying VAT. 8 milky chocolates. Cadbury avoided 60 million tax bill by moving HQ to Switzerland. 7 coffee steaming. Starbucks Coffee has paid only £15 million in corporation tax in 5 years. 6 future folding. IKEA reduces tax by sending 3% of sales to parent. 5 old things. eBay avoids £50 million in tax by channeling funds via Luxembourg. 4 calling phones. Vodafone paid no corporation tax in the UK last year. 3 French nails. Boots used loopholes to avoid paying 1.1 billion tax. 2 purple gloves. Topshop and Topman. Billionaire boss avoided a £300 million tax bill. And an iPad with a 3G paid less than 2% tax on profits outside the US. That is not good for the British economy, is it? But a weekend laugh. A mother and her 10-year-old son were riding in a taxi in New York. It was raining and all the prostitutes were standing under the awnings. "Mum," said the boy, "what are all those women doing?" "They're waiting for their husbands to get off work," she replies. The taxi driver turns round and says, "Geez, lady, why don't you tell him the truth? They're hookers, kid. They have sex with men for money." Little boy's eyes get wide and he says, "Is that true, Mum?" His mother, glaring hard at the taxi driver, answers in the affirmative. After a few minutes the kid asks, "Mum, what happens to the babies these women have?" "Most of them," she said, "become taxi drivers." You've been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynn Mozart, and I and the team at World at 8 and Radio Britain wish you all a very happy and a very safe weekend.
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday 30th of January 2015. T4TD, Russia, Islam, NHS and the real problem. By the way, T4 jail sentences of up to 14 years. According to the Ministry of Justice, there were 7,057 cautions handed to sex offenders in the UK since 2009. The figures come as authorities investigate allegations of historic child abuse during the 1970s and 1980s, including a suspected elite paedophile ring consisting of serving British politicians. Charities, including the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, NSPCC, have said the cautions may have been used if there was an issue regarding children having to give evidence in court, but warned that British courts needed to do more to protect victims of abuse. A custodial sentence for serious sexual offences sends a very clear message that society will not accept their behaviour in any way. It also reflects the lifelong damage that sexual abuse can have on children and young people, NSPCC spokesperson John Brown said. A prison sentence can also mean the offender is given therapy to ensure they understand the impact of their behaviour and to reduce their risk of re-offending. In response to the figures, ministers claim they're changing the law to stop the use of cautions on sex offenders. D stands for Thought For Today. Hundreds of UK child sex offenders spared jail, let off with cautions. House building hits 7-year high, more family homes on the market as detached new builds rise by a quarter. School isolates Somerset teenager over cancer charity haircut. Swedish soldier stirs row over help for ISIS fighters. Marine Le Pen leads French presidential poll with 30% of the vote. Woman who banned Muslims for her Arkansas gun range says business is booming since she banished them as a matter of public safety. And Egypt's El-Sisi cuts short Ethiopia visit after ISIS-affiliated terrorist group kills 26 in deadly Sinai attacks. And finally, 2 for 1 Day Friday. UK News. Hundreds of UK child sex offenders spared jail, let off with cautions. Hundreds of sex offenders are being given lenient punishments by British judges despite committing abhorrent crimes against children. According to official figures from the Ministry of Justice, hundreds of sex offenders have been let off with cautions despite the law saying they should face